You know, there was this old cafe I used to sit in years ago in the port city of Muscat. Omani coffee, cardamom so thick you could taste the whole Arabian Peninsula in a single cup. The fishermen outside would talk about the strait, the Hormuz, like it was a living thing, not a body of water, a mood, a temperament. They said the strait had its own memory. It remembered the Portuguese galleons, it remembered the British gunboats, it remembered every single empire that tried to turn it into a toll booth. Well, the strait remembered again. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched what they called Operation Epic Fury, a massive joint air campaign against Iran. Within hours, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was dead. His daughter, his granddaughter, his son-in-law, gone. 40 senior officials, including the defense minister and the IRGC commander, erased from the chessboard in a single night. The Israelis called it Roar of the Lion. Washington called it self-defense. The rest of the world called it something else entirely. And then, as if history had been waiting in the wings for its cue, the Strait of Hormuz, that narrow 21-mile corridor between Iran and Oman, through which one-fifth of the planet's oil supply flows every single day, went dark. Ship traffic didn't decline, it collapsed, 95%, from hundreds of tankers a day to, effectively, zero. But here is the part nobody was ready for. On March 28th, exactly 1 month into this war, Yemen's Houthi rebels fired their first missiles at Israel. The movement that had already brought global shipping to its knees in the Red Sea during the Gaza war was back. And this time they weren't just targeting cargo ships. They were targeting a nuclear-armed state. In the span of 30 days, the two most critical maritime choke points on the planet, the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb, had both come under fire. Together, these two waterways carry roughly a third of all global trade. A third. Let that breathe for a moment. 1/3 of everything the world buys, sells, ships, and consumes, locked behind the barrel of an asymmetric war that nobody in Washington or Tel Aviv seemed to have wargamed for. Now I have spent the better part of 3 decades covering what I like to call Pipelineistan, that sprawling web of oil routes, gas corridors, and maritime choke points that quietly determines who eats, who freezes, and who prospers on this planet. And I can tell you, without a shred of exaggeration, what happened in March 2026 had no precedent, not in 1973, not in 1979, not during Saddam's tanker wars. Never, in the entire history of the global oil market, had two major straits been simultaneously weaponized. The International Energy Agency called it the greatest threat to global energy security in recorded history. The Dallas Federal Reserve ran the numbers. Removing 20% of the world's oil supply from the market would lower global GDP growth by nearly 3 percentage points in a single quarter. That is not a recession. That is a controlled demolition of the world economy. And here is the most astonishing detail, the one that future historians will circle in red ink. While Western tankers sat paralyzed outside the strait, Chinese-flagged and Indian-flagged vessels were still passing through. Iran, in an act of breathtaking strategic calculus, had turned the Strait of Hormuz into a selective toll booth. You want to pass? Fine. But you pay in Chinese yuan, not dollars. Yuan. Lloyd's List confirmed that at least 2 vessels had paid enormous sums. One report cited $2 million to use an alternative Iranian-controlled channel north of Larak Island, assessed by the Revolutionary Guards themselves. The payments, according to multiple intelligence sources, were settled in Chinese currency. Let me say that again because the implications are staggering. The most important oil choke point on Earth, the one that the petrodollar system was essentially built to protect, was now operating in yuan. The U.S. Navy, the most powerful maritime force in human history, had aircraft carriers in the region. It had submarines. It had Tomahawk missiles and F-35s, and the entire arsenal of the world's sole superpower parked in those waters. And yet Iran, battered, bombed, its supreme leader assassinated, its military degraded, was still collecting tolls in yuan. This was not just a military humiliation. This was the petrodollar system cracking at the waterline. Now, to understand why this matters, why it matters more than any battlefield casualty count or diplomatic press conference, you have to understand the architecture of the world we have been living in since 1971. When Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard, the replacement anchor was oil. Saudi Arabia agreed to price its crude exclusively in US dollars, and in return, the United States guaranteed the security of the Gulf. That was the deal. Petrodollars recycled through Wall Street. The dollar became the world's reserve currency not because of gold, but because of oil. And the physical guarantor of that system was the US Navy's ability to keep the Strait of Hormuz open. That guarantee just evaporated. The irony, and it is an irony so thick you could cut it with a scimitar, is that it was Washington's own war that broke its own system. The US attacked Iran. Iran closed the strait. And in the chaos, China walked through the door. Beijing did not fire a single missile. It did not deploy a single warship. It simply kept buying oil at a discount, while the West scrambled to release 400 million barrels from strategic reserves, the largest emergency drawdown in IEA history. But let us go further, because the Hormuz story, dramatic as it is, was only half the nightmare. The Houthis, Ansar Allah, as they call themselves, had been conspicuously quiet for the first month of the Iran war. Analysts debated why. Some said Iran's IRGC was holding them back, preserving them as a strategic reserve. Others pointed to Israeli threats. In August 2025, an Israeli strike had already killed several top Houthi ministers. The movement's leaders went underground, refusing to appear in public, moving between safe houses in Sana'a. The US had sent warnings through Omani intermediaries. Stay out or face the consequences. For 29 days, the Houthis listened. On day 30, they stopped listening. The first missile launched from Yemen toward Israel was intercepted. Then came a second wave. Drones and ballistic missiles, the same cocktail that had terrorized Red Sea shipping throughout 2024. The Houthis issued a statement linking their action to solidarity with Iran, Palestine, Lebanon, and Iraq. But the real message was not in the words, it was in the geography. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the Gate of Tears, as the Arabs named it centuries ago, sits at the southern entrance to the Red Sea between Yemen and Djibouti. Through this narrow passage flows roughly 12% of global trade, including a significant share of Europe's energy supply. 30% of Europe's jet fuel either originates from or transits through this corridor. When the Houthis disrupted Red Sea shipping during the Gaza war in 2024, the world got a taste of what asymmetric maritime warfare looked like. Shipping companies rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks to transit times and billions to costs. Now imagine that scenario, but combined with the Hormuz closure. 2 choke points simultaneously, one controlling 20% of global oil, the other 12% of all seaborne trade. Together they form what maritime strategists call the energy crescent, the arc of water stretching from the Persian Gulf through the Arabian Sea, up through the Red Sea to the Suez Canal. This crescent is the circulatory system of the global economy, and in March 2026, both of its major arteries were blocked. The consequences hit the global south first and hardest. Pakistan closed schools for 2 weeks and shifted universities online to conserve energy. Laos reduced its school week. Fertilizer prices, dependent on Gulf-sourced natural gas, surged nearly 50%. In Bangladesh and sub-Saharan Africa, the cost of cooking fuel spiked to levels that pushed millions closer to the edge. Sri Lanka, still recovering from its 2022 economic collapse, watched helplessly as fuel shipments stalled. The World Food Programme issued emergency warnings about food supply chains in East Africa. This is the part of the story that rarely makes the front pages in Washington or London. When the strait closes, it is not American suburbanites who suffer first. It is a mother in Dhaka trying to buy cooking gas. It is a farmer in Nigeria waiting for fertilizer that is sitting in a tanker somewhere off the coast of Oman. It is a school in Lahore that shuts down because there is not enough electricity. The empire drops its bombs and the shrapnel lands 10,000 miles away in places the bombers have never heard of. But let us talk about the mechanics of this dual blockade because the details are extraordinary. Iran did not simply close Hormuz with a declaration. It closed it with mines, missiles, drones, and fast attack boats. The IRGC operates a swarm doctrine, hundreds of small fast vessels, many armed with anti-ship missiles, operating in the narrow waters where big naval vessels are most vulnerable. At least 5 tankers were struck in the first days. 2 crew members were killed. Over 150 ships anchored outside the strait, unwilling to risk passage. Major container lines, Maersk, CMA CGM, Hapag-Lloyd, suspended all transits. The geography favored Iran overwhelmingly. The strait is only 21 miles wide. Iran controls the entire northern shore. Its coastline is studded with missile batteries, radar installations, and concealed launch sites carved into the cliffs. U.S. defense officials privately admitted that clearing the strait would require a sustained campaign, weeks, possibly months, of minesweeping and coastal suppression. And Iran had another card, midget submarines, small, quiet, almost invisible to sonar in shallow, noisy waters, the nightmare scenario for any Navy commander. Meanwhile, Iran established its own transit channel north of Larak Island, bypassing the standard international shipping lanes south of the island. This was a masterclass in asymmetric leverage. Iran could not match the U.S. Navy ship for ship, but it did not need to. All it needed to do was make the strait too dangerous for anyone without its permission to cross. And that is exactly what it did. Now, here is where the most surprising geopolitical detail emerges, and it is a detail that reshapes everything we thought we knew about the so-called multipolar world order. When Iran needed help most, when its supreme leader had been assassinated, its military degraded, its cities under bombardment, neither China nor Russia came to its rescue in any meaningful military sense. Russia was bogged down in Ukraine, its S-400 systems and advanced fighters committed to its own war. China, navigating a delicate trade negotiation with Trump and desperate to avoid a confrontation over Taiwan, kept its distance. Beijing issued diplomatic condemnations. Moscow called the strikes reckless, and that was it. No weapon shipments, no military intervention, no dramatic cavalry charge from the east. BRICS, the great hope of the multipolar dream, could not even produce a joint statement. 2 weeks into the war, as Foreign Policy's C. Raja Mohan observed, the grouping that was supposed to be the counterweight to American hegemony had been exposed as a collection of sovereign states pursuing their own interests. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, both BRICS members, broke with Tehran over Iran's retaliatory strikes on their territory. India, the current BRICS chair, refused to take sides. Indonesia was silent. Even Uganda, offered to fight alongside Israel. And yet, look at what actually happened beneath the diplomatic surface. China's tankers kept moving through Hormuz. Indian destroyers began escorting tankers in the Gulf of Oman. Pakistan, a country with a nuclear arsenal and a shared border with Iran, emerged as the primary mediator between Washington and Tehran, with Beijing's explicit backing. Wang Yi publicly praised Islamabad's peace efforts. And the payments flowing through Iran's shadow channel were denominated in yuan. So the multipolar order did not rally to Iran's defense with tanks and fighter jets, but it did something arguably more consequential. It demonstrated that the US no longer had the ability to unilaterally control the flow of energy. The most powerful military on earth launched a devastating war, and within a month its adversary was still collecting tolls on the world's most important waterway in a currency that was not the dollar. This is what the end of unipolarity actually looks like. Not a dramatic showdown, not a Cold War-style standoff, but a slow, grinding erosion of the assumptions that held the old order together. The assumption that the US Navy could always keep the straits open. The assumption that the dollar was the only game in town. The assumption that America's wars would be quick, decisive, and without systemic blowback. All three assumptions shattered in 30 days. And then came the Houthis, and the crisis doubled. The timing was not accidental. The Houthis entered the war precisely when it would cause maximum disruption, not just militarily, but economically. Their missiles and drones threatened to close the el-Mandeb at exactly the moment when the world was desperately trying to reroute oil around the Hormuz closure. Saudi Arabia had already begun diverting crude through its east-west pipeline to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. If the Houthis turned the Red Sea into a war zone again, that alternative route would be compromised too. Think about that. The world's plan B for the Hormuz closure was the Red Sea, and the Houthis just put plan B under fire. The global shipping industry was facing something it had never faced before, a dual choke point crisis. The only remaining route from Asia to Europe, The only one not threatened by missiles and drones was the long voyage around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 2 to 3 weeks to transit times and tens of thousands of dollars to the cost of every shipment. Insurance premiums skyrocketed. Lloyd's of London expanded its list of high-risk maritime zones to include virtually the entire Arabian Peninsula. The cost of shipping a container from Shanghai to Rotterdam jumped to levels not seen since the peak of the COVID supply chain crisis and kept climbing. But here was the deeper structural reality that the crisis exposed. The entire architecture of globalization, as designed by the West over the past 4 decades, was built on the assumption that these sea lanes would always be open. Free trade, just-in-time supply chains, comparative advantage, all of it rested on the invisible foundation of secure maritime corridors. And that foundation turned out to be surprisingly fragile. A ragtag militia in the mountains of Yemen, armed with Iranian drones and locally produced missiles, had the power to impose costs on the global economy that rivaled those of a great power war. This was the lesson of 2024, and the world had refused to learn it. Now in 2026, the lesson came back with compound interest. Let me bring this back to the human level, because numbers and geopolitical abstractions can obscure the reality of what people actually experienced. In Tehran, entire neighborhoods had become ghost towns. Schools were closed. Banks operated at reduced capacity. Prisoners in Evin prison were receiving only bread and water. The University of Science and Technology, one of Iran's oldest institutions, had been bombed. The IRGC, in response, issued an ultimatum. If the U.S. did not condemn the bombing of Iranian universities by March 30th, American and Israeli university campuses in the Gulf would be targeted. Texas A&M in Qatar, Northwestern in Qatar, NYU in Abu Dhabi. Suddenly, the war was not just about missiles and oil, it was about the places where knowledge is produced, where young people go to imagine a future. In Lebanon, Israeli strikes had killed over 1,100 people since March 2nd, including journalists and paramedics. In Israel, Iranian missiles struck residential areas near Jerusalem, hospitalizing 7. In Saudi Arabia, an Iranian attack on an airbase wounded 12 U.S. service members, 2 of them seriously. In Kuwait, drones hit the international airport. In Bahrain, fuel storage tanks at the airport were struck. In Dubai, a drone hit a residential building. The war had spilled out of Iran and into the entire region. 12 countries had been attacked by Iranian forces. Air raid sirens sounded from Bahrain to Kuwait to Oman. The Gulf Cooperation Council, those gleaming towers of Dubai and Doha and Riyadh, discovered that their proximity to American military bases made them targets, not safe havens. And in the middle of all this chaos, a quiet meeting was convened. Not in Washington, not in Brussels, not at the United Nations, in Islamabad. On March 29th, the foreign ministers of Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt gathered in the Pakistani capital to try to broker an end to the war. China expressed its support through Wang Yi. The United States acknowledged Pakistan's role as mediator. Trump reposted Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif's peace offer on Truth Social. A gesture read in Islamabad as tacit endorsement. The irony was impossible to miss. The Western institutions that were supposed to manage global crises, the UN Security Council, NATO, the G7, were either paralyzed or irrelevant. The Security Council could not pass a resolution because both the GCC draft and the Russian draft were blocked. NATO had no role. The G7 met in France to discuss the crisis but produced nothing actionable. It was Pakistan, a country that most Western policymakers treated as a secondary concern, that emerged as the diplomatic linchpin. This was the new geography of power, not the one drawn in Washington think tanks, the one drawn by necessity, by proximity, by the simple fact that Pakistan shared a border with Iran, had good relations with both Washington and Tehran, possessed a nuclear deterrent, and had a foreign minister who could pick up the phone and call everyone. The old Silk Road, the one that carried spices and silk and ideas from China to the Mediterranean, ran through exactly this corridor, through Iran, through Pakistan, through Central Asia. The new Silk Road, the one being built with pipelines and fiber optic cables and container terminals, runs through the same lands, and when the shooting started, it was these same lands that stepped forward to stop it. Let me leave you with a question, not an answer, a question. For 70 years, the United States maintained what it called a liberal international order. At the heart of that order was a simple promise. America would keep the sea lanes open, and in return, the world would trade in dollars. That promise was the foundation of the petrodollar. It was the foundation of globalization. It was the reason the U.S. Navy had 11 aircraft carriers and bases in 40 countries. In March 2026, that promise was broken, not by America's enemies, but by America's own war. The U.S. attacked Iran, Iran closed the Strait, the Houthis closed the Red Sea, and the world discovered that the Emperor's navy, for all its power, could not keep both waterways open at the same time. The oil that did flow through Hormuz moved in Chinese tankers, paid for in yuan. The mediation that did happen took place in Islamabad, brokered by Muslim-majority nations. The countries that suffered most were the ones that had no seat at any table: Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Sub-Saharan Africa, the global south that had been promised that free trade and open seas would lift them out of poverty. So the question is this: if the system that was supposed to guarantee global stability is the same system that produced this crisis, if the guardian of the sea lanes is the one who lit the fire, then what comes next? What replaces the order that just broke? Is it the multipolar world that Beijing and Moscow have been promising because BRICS could not even write a press release? Is it the old American hegemony, rebuilt and rebranded because the carriers are still there, but the tolls are being collected in yuan? Or is it something else entirely, something that has no name yet? Something being born right now in the smoke above Tehran and the quiet meeting rooms of Islamabad and the tanker lanes north of Larak Island, where Iranian guards wave through Chinese ships and the future of the global economy passes in silence through a strait that remembers everything. The fishermen in Muscat had a saying: "The sea does not care who claims to own it. It only respects those who understand its currents." Right now, the currents are changing, and the world, our world, is learning, painfully, that the age of guaranteed passage is over. What comes next is not a return to the old order. It is something new, something turbulent, something that will be shaped not by those who have the most weapons, but by those who understand the water. The Strait of Hormuz is open tonight, but only for those who pay in yuan. The el-Mandeb is under fire. And somewhere between those two bodies of water, between the Gate of Tears and the Corridor of Empires, the 21st century is being rewritten, not with ink, with oil, fire, and the ancient patience of those who have always lived at the crossroads. Stay awake. This story is far from over.